The stones of the old fortress sweated salt when the morning blew in. They sweated it like a living beast, a slow brine that beaded along the black seams and ran in thin threads down flanks hewn to resemble the ribs of dragons. The sea was in the walls and under the floors, in the joints of door iron and the throats of the chimneys. When the wind turned, it carried the rich, errant breath of the volcano, sour and eggy and warm, like a forge fired with rotten pearls. On such mornings the smoke from the dragon mont hung low as a saint's veil, and the gulls complained without conviction. Already full from the night's fishing, Helya stood barefoot on the basalt stairs of the eastern quay and watched the harbor wake. She had a wicker basket looped to her elbow and a knife in her hand that had belonged to her mother, and to her mother before that. The knife had a dragon-glass handle and a blade of soft-reach steel, etched faintly with Valyrian spirals, a flea market inheritance given on a day when the winter foamed and the gulls fell stiff out of the air. She traced the edge with her thumb, while the first of the day's lanterns guttered along the masts. The lanterns were little cages of green glass, 6 to a mast, hung as the charter required. Signal and tax paid at once. They came from everywhere now. The ships. Low-bellied cogs from Old Town with saffron, copper pans and kegs of the arbor's yellow wine. Long-shanked galleys out of the Valyrian yards at tidewatch, their banks of oars painted sky blue and sea green, so that the water seemed to make and unmake them with every stroke. Pinched-nosed skiffs out of Rosby and Duskendale with lumber, bundled in tar smelling like bitter mosses. Even sometimes the gray-bearded boats from Wakenlife Wintersulloch. They came because Dragonstone was safe and dangerous in exactly the right measures. Safe to freight and dangerous to offend. A shadow crossed Helya's bare toes. She did not look up. It was not yet the hour to look up. The first pass always belonged to them, and there would be another, closer, when the riders liked to count. Somewhere a horn sounded, a long burr with a fishbone in it. That was the east watch at the knife gate, acknowledging the arrival of the sea lantern out of Lice. Helya knew that ship by the noise of its rigging alone. Its captain kept 3 spare anchors lashed to the mainmast, with chains rather than rope. In a gale, those chains sang a different note from any line. She had learned the difference as a girl. Sleeping no more than 2 streets from the harbor, and waking to ships, as surely as a mother wakes to a babe's fret. Now she was nearly 30, with a husband who worked black glass, and 3 boys who went out to set crab baskets when the moon was fat, and still she sometimes woke at a sound, and lay listening to the harbor talk to itself in iron and hemp and gull. The ship turned on the morning tide in a wide, sure circle, her oars shipped, her hull showing a blush of copper where barnacles had been scraped. Men along the quay shouted, some in the thick vowels of the reach, some in the clipped consonants Helya had learned to hear as money. The Lyseni answered, lazy as cats. Helya could not see the captain's face at that distance, but she pictured him, oil on his beard, rings on his fingers, the lazy assurance of a man who had paid the harbor tithe 300 times, and knew the harbormaster's son by his milk name. Move. A voice snarled behind her. Move, woman. Count your fish somewhere else. Helya did not move. She was not on the quay proper, only on the basalt stairs. The stairs belonged to the sea, and the sea belonged to the mother, or to the dragons, depending whom you asked and what you wanted of them. She turned, slowly, to look up into the face of the man who had spoken. He wore a surcoat of coarse gray linen with a seahorse stitched badly upon it. Some landed fool's second son playing at factor. He saw her looking and drew his shoulders up. I will say it again, he informed her, with a measured patience that meant he had practiced it for people like her. Move. Helya opened her palm and showed him the dragon-glass handle. What's that to me, he said, blinking, clever at the wrong thing. A kitchen knife? The glass was fused in the fire of a dragon, Helya said in her softest voice, so that he had to lean closer to hear, so that he had to smell the sea and the sour warmth of the volcano in her hair. It bears the heat in it still. You may touch the blade if you like. Bam? He swayed back, uncertain not because he believed her, but because he did not. Go around, she offered, and mind your step. Basalt sweats in the morning. He stared a moment longer, decided that yes, she was one of those, and went around, his boots clumping. She smiled to herself and took 3 slow breaths. The tide spread its green tongue and licked at the lower steps. A coil of rope downstream twitched as if it dreamed. The second shadow came low and deliberate. The gulls were quiet. Helya looked up then, because it would have been a kind of sin not to. The dragon was dark as the stone and wet-looking from neck to tail, as if it had just climbed from the sea. Its wings were not so broad as the story said they should be, but they took the air like knives and set it in fresh order. Steam rose faintly from its nostrils. Its rider leaned to look down, hair bright, skin pale as fish flesh. Helya saw the little movement of the hand that meant a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, and saw him smile. He was young. The young always smiled. Ebonwing. Someone breathed near Helya's elbow. Lady Alis is with her. It is not the lady, someone else said, low. Her brother. The one who carries the winter sword. Helya did not like to have the names, so to herself, she said only dragon, rider, and watched the creature's shadow slide across the hulls and the quay and the water, as if it were a separate thing entirely. A black cloth cast by an unseen hand. The dragon tipped one wing, a little salute to the harbor, to the ships, to the morning, and climbed. When it passed into the sun, the world went bright and hot for a heartbeat, and Helya shut her eyes. When she opened them, the harbormaster's clerks were setting out their slates, and the tacksmen had put on their blue capes, and the first quarrels of the day were beginning in 3 places at once. She went down 2 more steps and let the tide wet her feet. On the height above the harbor, where the wind carried salt and smoke up a notch and made the pennons of towers clack against their poles, the rider dismounted at a run. He slid lightly to the shoulder, vaulting to the saddle stone, and dropped with the unthinking faith of a child who has jumped from the same wall his entire life. Stable boys ran forward with poles of brass capped in bone, the old Valyrian sign for leave, gentle, good, good, and the dragon crouched to let them place the poles along the tender skin of its lower jaw. It chuffed, displeased at being kept from the sun when there were cliffs to warm, eyes half-lidded like a sleepy dog's, then folded and slid and was still, an elaborate puzzle suddenly solved. "A moment, my lady," said Sir Rald, who had served 3 Targaryens and forgotten the names of a dozen riders who had not lived long enough to matter. He had a soldier's habit of calling all Targaryens lady, as if to open his mouth to say, Lord was to invite a vow he did not mean to swear. He held out a damp cloth, steaming faintly. "Your hands." Megan took it and wiped the soot from his palms. He was less careful than his sister, and when he pulled the cloth away, there was a little black half-moon of ash left under his right thumbnail. Sir Rald grimaced, took Megan's wrist in his big, cool hand, and scraped the crescent away with his dagger, like a mother tidying a child before a sept feast. "You smell of the mountain," Sir Rald said. "I flew near," Megan answered. "She likes to see her brother. She has neither sex nor siblings," the old knight said, and allowed himself a tiny smile. Megan laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. He was tall, with the rangy look of a man who might yet grow a little taller, and he wore his hair loose, which his sister did not. The wind laid it along his cheek in a white sheet. "The harbor is full," he said, glancing down toward the water. "The Lyseni came in with the dawn. The Mirish galley we were told of has not. There are 5 boats from Duskendale with timber. A cog out of Old Town that sits too deep for her declared load. 3 smaller craft from Rosby. A strange man with a seahorse stitched askew upon his coat." "Harbor gossip now," Sir Rald said. "You will unmake my trade, sweetling." "Your trade is safe," Megan said. "But the Old Town cog is worth a look. And I will have the seahorse explained." "No. They will be waiting in the Hall of the Coals," Sir Rald reminded him. "If you mean to take the east road to Tidewatch after the council, you will want your boots on and a mind in order. The Hightower's factor will expect both." "I will give him one," Megan said, "and keep the other for myself." He walked across the warming stones toward the inner keep. Floor like a dragon's folded wing, air smelling of metal and egg. The Hall of the Coals took its name from the great pit in its center, lined in black stone and raked every night by men with long iron tines who burned sea wrack and driftwood and peat, and once, when he was a boy, a dead whale calf whose mother had sung to the harbor until the tide reversed with grief. The fire never went out. He had asked his sister once whether they ought, as riders, to love the sea as well as the fire. She had said, "We are not kings of either. We are blood of the fire. The sea keeps us honest." Bam! In the hall, the flames were low, banked under a skin of ash, in which red eyes watched. A greenish light came through the stained windows. Sea light. His sister was there already, stones sewn into her belt that had cooled on the black sand beach and polished themselves smooth in the turning of a tide. She measured out her days with pebbles and found it brought her peace. Sometimes he thought she would scatter them in a line and walk away on them into the surf and never sink. "Alice," he said. "Brother." She did not turn. She was reading a sheet of parchment that a clerk had written at 4 in the morning. In a hand so neat and strained, it made Megan's fingers ache. "Old Town's man is come?" he asked. "8 tide watch," she said. "Where you will go, I will hold the bench here. Sir Roald told you of the Mirish galley. She was seen off the caves." The captain spied the sun upon her oars. She should have made harbor by now. Alice folded the parchment and tucked it away. The captain was drunk, or he saw the oars of another, or they were pirates, or the sea took her. "Which of these would you like?" "Ben?" "None," Megan said. "They carry glass. Our furnaces want the good sand. They want the coal from the rills more," Alice said without heat. "We cannot warm both the mountain and the poor in winter, Megan. Choose with clean hands." "Always the poor," Megan said, out of the old quarrel between them. It never grew rancorous because both knew the other's part thoroughly. She was fire and law. He was wind and luck. She measured and counted and smoothed. He tossed and startled, and asked the questions of men who sat down to tables, fully knowing they would refuse to pay if they could. "Then we will write to Sir Harmon Tall," Alice said, already seeing the line of the letter, the compliment that would butter the sentence that held the ask. "We will say the fires grow mean in the spring and the mountain sulks. We will ask for more coal to keep the furnaces sweet, and we will pay for it with the quarries at Dire Den for 1 season. Then tea. You like a bargain that seems to cheat us and does not. A bargain that makes the other man think he has cheated us is best." She agreed. "We do not have to be loved, Megan. We have to be necessary." "We are necessary," he said, and did not say to whom, because in that lay the whole of their work. Necessary to Valyria, whose archons loved their taxes taken without fuss. Necessary to the Reach, whose wine found better prices in the plazas of Mantaries and Tolos than it did in any western hall. Necessary to the Vale, who had ore and no furnaces of size. Necessary to the Crownlands, who were more often hungry than not. Necessary even to merchants of Bravos, who hated them in the clear manner of men who could not yet quite do without a rival. Men loved their rivals who made them rich. "Tell me about the seahorse," Alice said, turning at last to look at him. Her eyes were the soft gray of gull feathers, and when she smiled the fine points of her teeth showed. She had their mother's mouth and their father's jest. "He came near Helia," Megan said. Alice knew the name without needing to drag it out of a clerk's memory. The woman with the glass-handled knife. She refused to move from the steps, because the steps belonged to the sea. "Good? The man?" "Younger son," Megan said. "He wore the badge of House Valerian, but crookedly. Likely a simpleton playing factor, or some overreaching cousin." Alice's mouth twitched. "The Valerians know better than to sow their beasts poorly. They have been watching us since before our father's father was born. If a child of theirs comes up our steps with a seahorse sewn sideways, expect a purpose." "Then? Shall I find him?" "No," she said. "Let him find you. Men who wear the wrong badge want to be seen." He laughed. "As I do. As you do." and the fire under the ash blinked at both of them. The hall of the coals filled as men and women came in with slates and wax tablets and wind-blown hair. The day steward recited the names of ships in harbor, trading what and owing what. The night steward recited the names of ships that had left, permitted the tide and the tax, escorted to the gullet by galleys under the green dragon banner. A scribe from the East Watch reported rumors of a raider out of Blackwater Bay with a cat painted on her sail and a trick of throwing pots of burning pitch by sling. A mason spoke of a crack like a snake in the eastern pier that needed binding before midsummer storms. A priest of the Seven spoke about men who slept under the quay and pissed on the sea and what that did to the dignity of God. And a woman from the foundry stood on her heels and said that if God wanted dignity, he should give the foundry's men with lungs that did not turn black in 20 winters and eyes that could see at night. The priest crossed himself and said he would pray for her. She said, "I asked for coal," and sat down. Elise listened with her chin propped on her fist, making piles on the bench with her cooled pebbles, dividing them into problem and promise. She would add one to promise when a clerk gave an unexpectedly clear account. One to problem when a thing came wrapped in righteousness and without numbers. Megan let the talk wash. He measured the texture of the morning against 100 mornings like it and decided it would rain by evening, and that a certain Hightower factor would hate rain. When the stewards had done with their recitations and the priest with his concern and the mason with his crack, Elise signaled with 2 fingers and the hall quieted. "We have received word from Old Town," she said. "Sir Benifer Hightower." "So?" A woman from the stables behind the hall murmured to her neighbor. "He is Benifer and not Morin. I win a cake. Sends his cousin Lauren with power to propose a charter for an inland road. It is the Hightowers' wish to see a paved way from Old Town to the Blackwater Rush that is not subject to spring swamps or autumn floods. They will provide stone and men. They ask that we provide fire and coin. They ask that we provide fire and coin." The murmurs multiplied. Fire meant dragons to warm and fuse the stones, to seal the seams of the road with glass so that frost could not creep in and split it. Coin meant more obvious things. They would build a Hightower road through the king's lands, someone said. "Will Rosby give passage?" "We will make Rosby necessary to the making," Alis said. "We will promise them a counting house, a market held 4 days of every month under our charter. We will promise them adjudication when quarrels come. We will promise them a lantern tower to guide their boats into the bay. Men like to be given light." "Who pays for the lantern tower?" Megan asked lazily, knowing. "Rosby," she said, smiling without looking at him. "With our coin, which we will call a loan, and which they will forget. They owe us because they will then owe us in better ways." A clerk snorted, and Elise tipped a stone from promise to problem. "Do not snort," she said mildly. "You sound like a goat. Our cousins in Valyria love goats." "They love the meat," the clerk said, properly abashed. "They love that goats go where men will not, and eat what men will not, and make milk out of it. We will be goats this year." She rose. "Megan will go to Tide Watch. He will sit with Lauren Hightower and drink whatever it is they pretend is wine, and ask him what the Citadel thinks of our bargain. Then he will come home and tell me where the goat can put its feet without falling. Then oh." She walked down from the bench then, and the men and women of Dragonstone's work rose as one. It was not obeisance but habit, the natural standing of backs when an obligation leaves a room. "Take Sir Rauld," she told Megan, soft. "He sees tempers before they break." "I have mine," Megan said. "I cannot spare more than one," Elise said, and her eyes went past him to the fire, which had opened a sleepy eye to regard her. "I am to meet with the Bravosi in the afternoon. They intend to ask for something I am not ready to give." "What is that?" Megan asked. "They have a loan to our cousins in Valyria. They think we should guarantee." "Ah," he said. "The Iron Bank is always iron until it wants a dragon's coin. And then it wants a dragon's oath," Elise said. "I would rather give them my teeth." "You have pretty teeth," he said, which made her laugh, and then not laugh again. He buckled on his boots in the side hall where the cool air held the sour sweet of apples from the cellars and the old stale heat of previous fires. He checked the winter sword at his hip, a long thing with no Valyrian letters upon it, forged in the north by a smith who had climbed to the mountain and watched a dragon breathe before he set hammer to iron. The blade had taken something of that watching into itself. When it was drawn, the air near it trembled as if from heat, though it remained cool. The smith had been paid in pearls the size of a child's fingernails, and a letter that gave him passage under green lanterns for his lifetime. He had used that letter once to take his wife to see the sea. The courtyard cobbles were wet. His horse stood with ears cocked. The kind of animal that would think about you twice and decide whether you were worth the work. Megan stroked the smooth space above its eye and swung up. Sir Ralph mounted with that ancient carefulness that belongs to men who have learned how little grace there is in falling, and they rode out under the teeth of the inner gate and past the outer dragons and into the morning, down the road that had been glassed in strips so that winter could not break it. When the glass caught the sun, it threw fish scales onto their boots. The east road cut along the flank of the mountain and then turned to run the ridge above the little farms that clothed the islands back in lumpy quilts of cabbage and onions and root. Women stood in their doorways and shaded their eyes to watch the riders pass. Children leaned on fences and shouted nonsense that dragons and riders both knew to be blessing. The sea burnt white to their right, where it hit the black stones and was caught and made to pay with itself to pass. Tidewatch rose out of the water on its low spit of rock, with its colorful arrogance and its honest scars. It had not been built by architects who loved dragons. It had been built by men who loved ships. Its belly was a boathouse, where 10 galleys could be dragged up together. Its spine a long hall with ribs like a whale. Its skin a patchwork of shutters painted in the colors of men who had paid for them. The Valyrians had paid for most. A man with a sideways seahorse, Megan said as they rode into the forecourt, where the smell of pitch and salt warred and made a third smell that was not quite either. I will tell him to sew it straight. Sir Ralph, who had served 3 Targaryens and waited outside halls for 2 kings of Driftmark and 1 queen of nothing who ruled Tidewatch as if it were an empire because she had the quality of believing any room she was in was big enough, said nothing. They were shown into a room with a long table and a large map. The room between rooms that men who had decisions to make enjoyed sitting in because it felt as if things could be decided there without anyone noticing. There was a fire in a low brazier and a jug of wine and 3 cups, and none of them were reached for, which told Megan immediately that the Hightower man was not yet present and that the Valyrian who would not drink with Targaryens unless the other guest required it. He liked rooms that showed themselves. The Valyrian rose, and his seahorse was straight. Lord Oregon, Megan said, surprised into honesty and glad of it. I thought you would send a cousin and miss a chance to hear how you talk of roads. Oregon Valyrian was a man who had made peace with his age by sharpening it. His beard was white, where it had hair at all, his mouth quick. He had the warm eyes of an old dog and the hands of a thief. He wore a ring of black iron on his forefinger, as if to shame the gold on his other fingers with a story it could not tell. A storm had taken 3 fingers of one hand long before Megan was born. He made an art of not hiding it. Your ships came in light, Megan said, glancing at the ledger that lay on the table. But you paid as if they were heavy. I am to thank you for that. You are not, Oregon said. I paid for the space I will take, not the weight I carried. You carried nothing, if the numbers are to be believed. I carried an understanding, Oregon said without embarrassment. There is much to be moved if we come to terms today, and I will not have my galleys held at the mouth of the gullet while your clerks count barrels. I paid for my turn. Megan laughed. You were born too late to have been a Valyrian. You would have ruled us all in the old style. Dah. I am a Valyrian when it is convenient, Oregon said. And then, courteously, I am sorry for your mother. So am I, Megan said simply, and the 2 men stood a second in the habit of grief. Footsteps in the stones outside, a hand on the latch, a young man bright as a silver coin at noon. Loren Hightower had the coloring of his house, which was to say the coloring of wheat and late honey, and he had come in a cloak meant for show on a summer night in the arbor, not for the edges of spring on Driftmark. He hid his shiver with a smile so quick and so professional that it made Megan's teeth ache for him. "My Lord Oregon," Lauren said, bowing. "My Lord of Dragonstone." "Megan will do," Megan said. "Or nothing at all, if you prefer." "Megan," Lauren said, grateful not to have to decide which dragon honorific would insult fewer people. "Forgive my lateness. I was shown a thing I have never seen." "What was that?" Megan asked mildly, and poured wine though the other man had not yet asked for it. "A keel," Lauren said, his voice unfeigned for the first time. "Being laid upside down. I had only ever seen them laid right." "And no." Oregon's mouth tilted. "We build upside down and turn them when the ribs want to go home. Easier on the heartwood." "It will be an excellent road," Lauren said too quickly, as if to show he knew where he was. "The Citadel does not build roads," Oregon said. "They bless them with theory and curse them with caution." "Sit, boy. Drink before you start to be your cousin." Lauren sat. He drank. He nodded to himself, as if approving a note he had read in his own ledger. "I come with a charter," he said, and drew it out. He had written it with his own hand, at least. Megan could tell the difference between a clerk's hand and a noble's, even the noble's hand who had been trained to write like a clerk. The letters here stood on a common line, but their loops were content to be themselves. "Old Town will pay for the stone and men. The Hightower will be named along with Dragonstone as charterer. The road will run from the fish gate at Old Town as far as the first ford of the Blackwater. The lords whose lands it passes will be paid a toll on buildings sufficient to make them feel flattered, and thereafter a toll on passage so small they will feel cheated, but will take because they can pretend it is of their own devising. The Hightower will maintain 2 houses every 10 miles in which a traveler can buy warmth, bread, and a bed. Dragonstone will provide fire." He said the last word as if he knew he should not, but could not help himself. "Dragons," Oregon said for him, because he liked to break men of their careful euphemisms. "Not dragons," Lauren said, surprising them both. "Forgive me, but if the Citadel is to bless this, and they will, they would like to have a road on which letters do not sink in spring. Then it cannot be dragons sealing the seams and fusing the stones. They will say that is unnatural." "Unnatural." Oregon put the word in his mouth and rolled it like fruit gone a little too soft. "Unnatural like a tower that catches fire at the top and calls boats home from the sea? Unnatural like a stone that knows the hour by the sun? Unnatural like books?" Lauren smiled, rueful and defensive at once. "Unnatural like men who think they do not need God's blessing because they burn with a different fire." "Ah," Megan said gently. "There it is. And what would you have instead of dragons?" "There are portable kilns," Lauren said, relieved to be with numbers again. "There are ovens." "That burn how hot?" Oregon asked, all amiable curiosity. "Hot enough," Lauren said, because he did not know. Then he said, "Quieter, not as hot as dragons, but enough." Megan drew a little circle on the table with his fingertip. "And if we agree to this, what do we get for our patience?" "A road," Lauren said simply. "A reliable road. A way for your coal to get to your furnaces without sinking in spring. A way for our apples to get to your docks without rotting. A way for your letters to arrive when you mean them to. And a way that looks like a Hightower way." He said it with care, as if stepping upon stones set just far enough apart to drown any man with a long stride. Oregon watched him with the speculative fondness of a man who has bred horses and likes a colt that throws his head but does not waste his legs. "A Hightower way," Oregon repeated. "And in exchange for that, we will not put a dragon to it." "The Citadel will not bless a dragon road," Lauren said. "They will bless a kiln road, and men will travel it without thinking of their souls as they do." "No one travels our roads thinking of their souls," Oregon said. "They think of their purses." "My cousin thinks of both," Lauren said, then flushed, because he had not meant to admit to so many cousins in the room. Megan leaned back. The fire in the brazier made a sound like breath on a sleep-sore throat. "You are clever," he said. Only in rooms, Lauren said, as if confessing to a petty theft. Outside I am cold easily and too quick to laugh at the wrong thing. But in rooms I am not an idiot. What will the faith be paid to bless it? Oregon asked. Not because he did not know, but because he liked to hear what numbers a young noble would speak when religion put its hand to his throat. A tenth, Lauren said. From whom? Oregon asked. Lauren was pleased to be asked the question he had practiced. From everyone else's tenth. Oregon barked a laugh. Megan smiled. You cut the same loaf twice, Megan said. I like men who cut the same loaf twice and do not get their fingers. The Hightower will take less, Lauren said. Earnest. Not by much, but we will. You have my cousin's word. You are his cousin, Oregon said. Lauren looked down at his hands. Yes. And what is your word worth? I don't know, Lauren said. Like a man honest and young enough to be employed. Megan stood. We will send for pebbles and count. He was thinking of Elise and her 2 piles, and how she would move the stones when he told her this part. And we will send for a priest who can count without adding God to the column that says, outlay. And we will send for a mason who can tell us whether your kilns will suffice. They will, Lauren said, wanting to believe it firmly enough to compel the world. They may, Megan amended. What I like best is this. When men walk a road that your Hightower has blessed, it will be a Hightower road. When they enter a counting house under our lanterns, it will be a Dragonstone counting house. When they come to Driftmark to take ship, it will be a Valyrian quay. All will be called by the right names. Then some thought. And what will the crown call it? Lauren asked, sly all at once, apprentice showing a secret trick. Oregon grunted. The crown will call it a miracle, and then ask why it costs so much. They were at the point then, where men begin to believe they can make an agreement in one morning. Megan knew better. The morning would bloom into noon and the rain would come, and the priest would be late, and the mason would be drunk, and somehow the kilns would be hotter in rumor in the afternoon than in fact in the morning. He did not mind. He liked days that showed their hands and then asked to be waited upon. A page put his head in. No man could have come in so quietly and been other than a boy, and said something only to Oregon. The old Sea Lord listened, his face without performance. He nodded, and the lines around his mouth lay a little deeper. Forgive me, Oregon said, as if apologizing for the weather. A ship out of the stepstones. Sail torn. Men tired, they say. He stopped to ensure his voice did not add drama. They say a galley's bones are scattered on the rocks south of the caves. The Marish? Megan asked, the old muscle of worry under his ribs tightening for clear reasons, and for all the unclear ones too. They did not name her, Oregon said. But there are oars on the beach, and a length of red cloth. Red cloth meant nothing. Red cloth meant a wine cask. Red cloth meant a house in Pentos. Red cloth meant nothing, except that sometimes it meant a Lysany whose captain wore his beard oiled and rings on his fingers, and liked to pay less if he could. I will go, Megan said. Serald moved. Habit. Send another, he said. Let the mountain sulk with your sister's pebbles. You will break your day in half. Then let it break, Megan said, already thinking of the curve of Ebonwing's neck when she smelt blood and the way the surf sometimes threw up words in a language old as stone. A horn sounded from the tower above the inner quay. It was not a horn like the one that announced ships in good morning. It was a blunt, flat call like a palm against a chest. It meant only one thing, and even the Hightower boy, with his city ears, went pale with knowledge people are born with when they live on island edges. The horn sounded again. Blunt, flat. A reminder that the sea will demand the body if it lends the wealth. Forgive me, Megan said. To both men, to the room, to the wine, to the morning that was about to stop being itself and become another morning altogether. He ran, Serald behind him, and the smell of pitch and the itch of salt leapt to greet them. The rain that would own the evening had sent scouts ahead. The air was damp without being weather. Men were already uncoiling ropes and shouting, in a way that meant they were not sure whether to shout the truth or not. Tidewatch's boathouse was a cathedral of wood and light. When men dragged a galley down its belly, The sound was like a song sung by a giant child. "Ebonwing," Megan said. And the boy at the stable prayers looked both alarmed and offended, because there had been no prayers yet. "Ebonwing," Megan said again, and the boy bowed to the necessity and ran. On days like this, the world rid itself of all the coin and all the charter and came down to three things: a hull on a wrong shore, a swell that did not care, and whether a rider could make the air his own long enough to pull the living away from the places where the water wanted to keep them. The dragon's heat put a sheen on Megan's face that dried as it formed. Ebonwing shook once, like an animal remembering the name you had called it since it was new, and took the air at a running hop. Men below became the idea of men. The sea spread itself like a skin. He flew along the island's south spine where beaks of black rock lifted like old teeth out of the foam. Gulls circled as if considering whether to curse or praise. He saw the wreck at once, a shape like a broken finger with birds on it, and the sea working at it with patient indifference. The galley had struck where the chart was wrong, or the judgment poor. Her oars were teeth. Her mast lay like a man dead of an arrow. There were men on the beach, and there were men in the water, and there were only a few moments of men between those two. He felt, as he always felt in these moments, that the dragon and he shared one mind. It was not the mind of a man or a beast. It was a mind of single things done cleanly. Ebonwing dropped, angled, flamed low. Not at the men, but just beyond them, and the water leapt back from the heat as a horse leaps from a snake in the path. The men in the water flailed and shrieked without ocean, then set their feet in the instant of calm and stumbled toward the beach. Already other galleys from Tidewatch were pulling in on long sweeps, their oarsmen white-faced and singing to keep time, because singing makes men brave and stupid in exactly the right proportions. A figure stood on a rock just beyond where any cautious man would stand to say he had seen a thing. The figure lifted a hand, palm up, fingers spread as if making a question. Megan felt the peculiar prickle in his teeth that meant he had been marked. He looked and saw a beard with oil in it, and rings that had lost some shine in the salt. The man's mouth was not smiling, but it was the mouth of a man who smiled often, and easily and well. "Captain," Megan said. Could not know, but knew. He set Ebonwing to hover, and the dragon's wings beat the salt to spindrift around them. He leaned and held down an arm. The captain took it. It was the sort of moment men believe they will remember forever, and do not, because afterward there's always counting to be done, and grief, and food. But Megan held a man's weight, and felt his shoulder take it, and felt the dragon take the rest, and thought, in the strange quiet part of him that liked to joke at the stroke of a bell, that Elise would have called this a half-coin moment. He hauled the man up behind him where a child might sit, and Ebonwing turned, careful as a ship in a crowded harbor, and set down on the long sand where boys would later find glass pebbles that had not been there yesterday. "You have my debt," the captain said over the roar that still lived in the ears after the sea had made its noise. "I would pay it now if I had the coin." "You do not have to pay," Megan said, because such things were not accounted for at once, and because the man was shaking like a mast blown loose. "Still," the captain said, and touched his forehead with 2 fingers, "I am called Benero Colis. I sail often out of Lice. I came this time to pay my harbor tax, as always." "As always," Megan said, and smiled, because the gods loved a circle that closed on itself neatly. They pulled 3 men out of the water who would live, and 4 who would die by nightfall. They pulled 6 bodies out, 2 with eyes open and sand in their mouths, 4 in the loose shape of men undone. They burned none there, because the tide took them back after an hour and a half, and said mine in the voice that is not the sea's, but belongs to all endings. They took what the beach would yield, a sealed jar of figs, a netted bag of blue cloth with nothing in it but the smell of saffron, and left the rest. Megan stood with his boots in sand that pulled at them, and watched the water fold and refold itself over the space where the red had caught his eye from the room where men had thought of roads. When he rowed back, the rain had found itself and come in a sheet that laid a new skin over Tidewatch's planks and gave every rope a bit of slippery arrogance. Oregon was still at the table. Lauren had made a little island of parchment around himself. Sir Raould had found bread somewhere, and was eating it, as if it had insulted him once, and he had not forgotten. Megan told them what had been worth telling, and did not tell the part about the man whose weight had been correctly measured by a dragon and a rider. Those stories went wrong when reached for too early. "A road," Lauren said, as if the word alone could anchor the day against the tide of burnt ships and men who would never drink again. "A road," he said again, and set the parchment to rights. "Let us make a road," Megan said, and began to count his pebbles with his sister's habit. Promise in one hand, and problem in the other, the one never outnumbering the other by so much that a man could grow sleepy in his chair. In Old Town, the Citadel's chimneys had been smoking since before dawn, though the day was not yet worthy of smoke. Maester Thorin sat with his tea cooling and watched the smoke go its own way, because smoke did not care about reading. He had a letter from Dragonstone. It was written in a tidy, decisive hand, and it proposed a thing that was both sensible and metaphysically awkward. "They want a blessing," he said, to the girl who swept his floor with such attention that he suspected she swept in her dreams. "They ask a question about the nature of heat." "The nature of heat," the girl repeated, as if pleased to have been given a phrase to carry with her to the next room and beyond. "They would lay a road with kilns," Thorin said. "They would have us say that this is natural, that it is a work man may bless. But if I bless a kiln road, have I not also blessed the dragon that warms the kiln? Or does blessing stop at the edge of a beast's wing?" "Then?" The girl looked up from the broom. "My mother says blessing doesn't cross thresholds." "Ah," Thorin said, delighted. "You should be Archmaester. We could save a great deal of time if we only had a good carpenter to tell us where the door is." "Then no." She smiled and went back to her sweeping, and he turned the letter over and found that the wax that sealed it had not been ordinary wax at all, but glass so thin it broke under his thumb without a sound and lay on his desk like frost. It was an unnecessary bit of grace. That was what made him love it. On Driftmark, where the wind liked to turn men's words into other men's songs, Oregon Valyrian stood under a painting of a seahorse and listened to two cousins quarrel about whether to paint it again. He liked a good quarrel. It made a room lively, and in lively rooms, men remembered they were alive. He was still thinking of the road that would run like a stretched rope from the Hightower to Dragonstone, and of what would happen when men learned to pull themselves along it faster than they could run. In the sept at the edge of the Fisher's Quarter on Dragonstone, Septon Raymar lit 3 candles, and thought about the souls of men who lay a stone that had been warmed by a beast that had been warmed by a mountain that God had not approved in writing. He wondered, not for the first time, what blessing meant when the coins that bought bread were stamped with dragons. He had a boy that swept with too much piety. He meant to tell him to sing when he worked, not to mutter. Songs keep a man upright when the floor is interesting. In a small house with a floor that sweated salt, like the sea in a window that had been mended 3 times with lead, and once with a story about a man who had climbed a wall because a woman had told him not to, Helia set her knife down and watched her husband turn a lump of black glass with a careful heat until it thought about being a cup. "This one is for a lord," he said, which meant he would try to make it twice as thin as glass wanted to be, and it would break once under his hand, and he would swear once and then sing to the next until it forgot to break. "Then he will drink poorly," Helia answered, because men who drank from cups that pleased them did not drink carefully. "Make one for a woman with hands like yours." He grinned without looking up, his breath in time with his heat. In the street, men were arguing about the price of a fish that had started the day in a Myrish net and would end it in a stew that called itself humble and was not. The rain came at last, in its decided way, laying weights on eaves and calming the gulls. It made the Dragonmont think about its smoke and turned it inward, so that the air in the halls that afternoon was warmer than men liked, and the room where Aelys met the Bravosi smelled faintly of damp wool and a kind of coin that had been in many hands. The Bravosi had a face like a knife handle, not sharp, but shaped to be held, and his voice had iron filings in it. "We would have your oath," he said pleasantly, after an hour of not saying it. "You cannot," Aelis said, equally pleasantly. I have already promised it to my brother when he takes a wife he does not deserve. The Bravosi smiled. And when will that be? When the sea asks a dragon's permission to drown a man, she said, and laid down a pebble with her forefinger where he could see it. He had the grace to laugh, and to hate her for making him do it. The day wore on, and failed to end the business it had started, but it arranged it more neatly. That is a kind of ending. Megan returned to the Hall of the Coals, wet as a man who had stood under a waterfall for pleasure, and had a bowl of stew that had been humble at noon and noble by dusk. He told his sister about the red cloth. She told him about the Iron Bank's memory of oaths given, and the Citadel's memory of fires lit. He told her about Lauren, who was clever in rooms and cold outside. She told him about a priest who had learned to count without a god and looked lonely after. They both laughed about Oregon and his sideways seahorse that had not, in the end, been sideways at all. Tomorrow, Ailey said, rinsing her pebbles in a bowl and laying them along the edge to dry, you will go to Rosby. To promise a light, he said, and tasted the word as if it were a fruit new to his mouth. To promise to call it theirs. She said, we will pay for it with money called ours, and they will forget whose brightness it is. And if they do not forget, then they will remember when they see the ships come in under our lanterns and put out under ours. Light makes men honest. Manning. He thought of the beach and the dragon heat, and the men who had been alive in the morning and not by evening, and he did not say that light also showed things that could not be fixed, and that men sometimes looked at them and insisted they were other things entirely. In the night, when the city lay like a child between parents, the sea and the mountain, and pretended not to be awake, men moved who liked to be counted in the dark. On the eastern quay, a boy with a scar that bisected his lip and made his words seem always to be asking a question, tugged at a rope that should have been coiled and was not. He found, where the rope should have been, an absence shaped like a man's decision, and he touched it with his finger as if to ensure absences had edges. Then he ran, because he was smart enough to be scared of what he understood. Far out, beyond the line of the last safe lantern, a ship with no lantern at all moved like a thought a man has and does not confess. She had painted her name over twice, once with a word that meant river, and once with a word that meant cat, and Scour had not quite hidden either. She ran without singing. Men upon her did not laugh. They carried pots and slings, and a creed in their throats that said to take is to make. The rain washed most sounds away. When it paused to breathe, a dragon lifted its head on a dark ledge above the surf and opened one eye. The eye was not green or gold or red. It was the color of wet basalt, which is to say the color of the island itself, which is to say the color of something that endures. In the morning, the sea would smell of pitch and fish, and men would call that good business. The road would still want building, and the priest would still want blessing, and the bank would still want oaths, and the kiln would still want to be a dragon without being called one. In the morning, Helia would step onto the basalt stairs and show someone her knife, and the world would be an hour older and in need of counting. In the morning, Megan would tell his horse to be patient with rain, and Lauren Hightower would dress in a cloak that was too fine for wet wind because he had not brought any other, and Oregon would tell two cousins to paint the seahorse again, and do it properly, and Alis would lay out her stones and ask the fire under the ash whether it intended to behave. But now, in the world between, the dragon's eye went closed. The mountain breathed. The sea talked to itself in a language so old even gods had forgotten it. And the island waited, which is a kind of power the restless never learn, and the patient always spend, as if it is inexhaustible. The morning broke without apology or ceremony. It lifted itself out of the sea like a man with a sore back, and put its hands on the island's shoulders, and shook the sleep off. The rain had combed the stone in the night and left it shiny. Ropes glistened, shutters wore their wet as if it were lacquer, and the Dragonmon's smoke seemed to be considering the day rather than declaring it. Gulls walked in the street with the certainty of rent collectors. Helia woke before the gulls began their priestly complaints, and lay for a heartbeat in that narrow bed of quiet between the last dream And the first duty. Her husband slept with his mouth open. A habit that embarrassed him in the day, and which she loved, because it made him less careful. The boys had made a tent of their blanket, and taken all the heat. She slid from the bed and found the floor cool and faintly damp, a skin of sea on everything. When she lifted the window latch, the pain stuck a moment, and then sighed. And the smell came in. Brine, smoke, onions frying somewhere already, tar, horse, the particular sourness of the mountains inside breath that always found her no matter which way the wind went. There was a hollowness in her that should have been hunger and was not. She dressed without thinking. Skirt and belt, and the knife at her hip. The dragonglass warmed to her skin, as if it were pleased to go out. She put a heel of yesterday's bread in her mouth and chewed without tasting and listened. The harbor talked to itself. Not the bold morning shouts that would come with the first ships into the mouth, but the low voices with which men speak to ropes and buckets and their own hands in the hours before. She heard, because she always heard, the little wrong note in it. It was not a sound of danger so much as a silence where a nagging sound should be. She went down into the wet street. Her neighbor's boy, Tarl, the one with the lip like a question mark, skittered past, bare feet painting the stone with a new layer of rain. He looked up and down in one nervous sweep, and would have run past if she had not put a hand out and caught him by the sleeve. He jerked like a fish on a line, and then looked as if he might bite, and then recognized her, and let his breath go. "What?" she said, not unkind, because boys who knew where the world was crooked were to be listened to. He jutted his chin in the manner of all boys, toward the east quay, toward the knife gate. The lines on the red bollard. The ones they coil at night. They're not coiled. There's a gap. None. Ropes go missing. She said, because to say it out loud made it smaller. Not the red bollard ones, he said. Scorn and fear braided. Not those. The harbor wives say the red bollard is a door's hinge. She released his sleeve. Show me. He did not take her hand, but he wanted to, and she let him not. They ran. It was wrong to run on basalt when it sweated, and she would have scolded any other. The gulls stepped aside for them with offended dignity. At the east quay, the night fires were a memory, and the day fires not yet lit. The red bollard looked as it always looked, a thick-hipped, paint-fat thing with 6 coils of good harbor rope looped around its waist. 5 coils slept in their circles. One was indeed gone. The gap had that crispness and absence only has in the morning. Who took it? Tarl asked, demanding an answer that would smooth the hair back on his neck. We will find out, Helia said, and put her hand on the wood. It was cold and damp, and nothing at all like a hinge. She felt not a thing, but the edge of a thing, as if the morning had been cut and not healed yet. Find the harbormaster's clerk. Say Helia told you to say the red bollard is missing its 6th coil. Say it like that, all in one breath. Go. Day. Ganon. He went, absurdly glad to be trusted with words. She turned to the water and squinted. The eastern mouth of the harbor took the tide earlier than the west. The tide was coming, heavy and sullen this morning. The water made a sound against the pilings that was like a man muttering in his own language under his breath. When the clerk came, he came at a run that was almost a dignified walk. He had a cap on that ought to have kept the rain off his neck and didn't. He nodded at Helia, and then bent over the bollard as if it might tell him a secret if he put his ear close. Who signed the night ledger? Helia asked. The clerk straightened, affronted without reason. Gonal did, he said. And then because he was a man who disliked being told he was wrong when he was, or perhaps sorry. They split the hour. Find them both, Helia said. The island was not noble enough that any clerks resisted women who told the truth faster than other people. Gonal appeared with sleep lines on his face and both his shoes half buckled. He had the immediate look of a man who would defend himself even against water. Sari came behind him with hair caught in a simple twist, and her pen still behind her ear. The two of them looked at the gap as if it were a thing that had been done to them personally. I coiled 6, Sari said without preface. I do it always. The 6th is the one with the green tar stain. See the paint from last spring when the boys were sloppy. You can see where it used to sit. You looked at it in a rain squall? Gonal said, making reasonable noises because he did not want to think. I looked at it in my sleep, Sari said. When I sleep, I coil ropes. Bring the ledger. They brought it. Helia looked, though she did not read Valyrian script well enough to trust it under pressure. Sari took it from her and flipped with a finger that knew where to land. Here, she said. The red bollard. 6 coils at the change of the tide. 6. She looked up. 6. Someone took it in the hour after, Helia said quietly. For a reason. For a boat, Gonal said, beginning to spit words in the way men do when they perceive insult in the world. For a little boat that didn't want to pay a big man. For a fisherman who thought the harbor ropes are for the sea. Move along, Helia, if you please. The day begins. She did not. She felt the same hollowness in her that was not hunger, and now it had a shape. She looked at the water, then at the space between 2 pilings under the walkway. A space boys used as a doorway to their own universe when the tide sat low. The tide was coming. It had not come far enough to fill the space. She crouched and peered into it. Something small and stubborn lodged there, out of place. A knot of packed fiber no larger than her palm. Tied in a crocus knot she had only ever seen in her mother's stories about the stepstones, where men tied such knots to keep oil in a skin. The knot smelled faintly of resin and pitch, and something that made her tongue recoil, and then return because it was curious. Give me your hook, she said to Gonal, and when he blinked, she did not repeat herself. Sari had a hook because Sari was a person who did not like to be at the mercy of other people's tools. She passed it without looking, as if they had rehearsed this 100 times. Helia leaned and worked the knot loose with the hook's blunt nose. It came away with a crab's reluctance. The tide took the wet from the space like a breath drawn in. Helia put the knot on the stone and touched it with her knife's cold edge. The fiber parted and the knot unfrayed in a hiss. A trickle of something ugly smelling ran like a thought onto the stone. Gonal swore and then stopped, because swearing would admit something. Sari inhaled as if a story had just put its hand on her throat. Helia had no word for the smell and did not want one. She lifted her eyes to the east mouth and saw, far out, the faint darker line that meant a hull without a lantern piloting itself across the tide's pinion. Call the watch, she said, her mouth both dry and tasting of metal. The horn that answered was not the blunt flat of death at the rocks, but the lean, high sound that meant a thing was coming, and thought itself clever. Men ran, Dottie. Ropes were picked up and found to be too short, and were made longer by men who knew how to talk to rope. Spears were taken down so that they could be leaned upon while waiting. The harbor master's face went very calm. The calm that has nothing to do with quiet and everything to do with work. He set clerks running in 3 directions. He set a lantern boy up a pole and told him to forget the word fear. He pulled on his blue cape because tax was a banner as much as a coin. The boat came into view with the insolence of the small, sliding along the outer edge of the mouth, where the rocks did not mind being near. She had no painted name. She had a sail the color of cat tongue, and the cloth of it was patched so skillfully that the patches were prettier than the original. 6 men bent to oars. They rowed a boat that did not look like a raider's boat, but looked like a boat that had seen a raider and learned to admire certain ways of cutting the water. They had that particular way the shoulders move on men who have decided they will pass because the world has often let them. Signal, the harbor master said, and the lantern boy did what boys do with light. They made it look essential. The boat did not answer because it did not want to, and because no one had told it that light makes you safe, even when you think it makes you seen. The harbor master waited exactly long enough to be able to say later, truthfully, that he had given the boat the chance to be wise. And then he nodded, and the Eastern Watch threw a net into the mouth. It was a pretty net. A day's work had been spent on it last month, because the old one had been too heavy, and the new one wanted to be admired. It looked like a lace tablecloth a reach lady might spread at a summer tea. It hid knives in its threads. The boat saw it late, the way men see good manners late. One of the oarsmen shouted something that might have been a prayer to a god that answered quicker than the 7. The net took the bow. The boat's clever slide lost itself. And the tide, which likes to be obeyed, found the boat's flank and pushed like a man who has waited his turn, and now intends to have it. The boat came about too slow. The net bit, then tightened like a new promise. The cat sail bellied, and then sagged. The men shouted and pulled and cut, and the water pushed with that smiling insistence that makes islands. "Now," the harbor master said, as if he had not been waiting for this exact moment since he had put his first blue cape on 10 years ago. Pikes leaned and hooked. Lines flew. The net favored the men who had been drinking their harbor wine and paying their harbor tithe for years without complaint. The boat was drawn to the stone like a toy to a child's better hand. Men on the quay stood just close enough to see eyes and just far enough not to be in reach of knives. Helia saw, behind the boatmen, the resin-dark shapes of pots. She smelled again the ugliness on the knot she had cut. She lifted her voice without knowing she would. "Pitch!" she shouted. And though anyone who looked at her would have thought she had no right to shout at anyone, men moved because the word was old. Watermen hate fire where it shouldn't be. It offends them personally. Buckets appeared. The harbor master gestured, and the pale line took shape like a thought understood by 100 people at once. The men in the boat saw the buckets and hated them. That was when they began to lose. Hatred uncouples men from the work in front of them. They drew knives with that theatrical care men use when they have watched too many plays about themselves. One of them, young, with hair like wet straw stuck to his cheeks, raised a pot by its gut and made to sling it up and over and into the knot of folk at the quay's edge. He never got the swing right. A fishwife, with the shoulders of a draft horse and a mouth like a church door, stepped into the space he had meant for the pot to arc through, and put her hand up the way women put their hands up to quiet a child. She took the pot's weight as if it had been a basket of string beans, and then she passed it down the pale line as carefully as if it were a sleeping infant. The boy swore in a language that had lived on islands smaller than this one for too long to care who spoke it. He went for another pot. He did not get that one either. Helia had her knife in her hand, and the edge of it thought the world softer than it was. She cut the gut, and the pot slumped, spilling a slow oil like sin into the bottom of the boat. "Don't light it," she said to him softly, because he had had the idea and it was sitting under his tongue like a curse. Don't. Ebonwing's shadow crossed them, shading the argument. The dragon came out of the morning without sound and made a new air under his wings. He did not flame. There was oil and rope and faces near, and dragons are not stupid. He dropped his body low, and the boat thought it had been pressed by the mountain. The men in it cried out and fell to knees they had forgotten they owned. The harbor master's men hauled. The boat kissed the stone with a hollow sound like a barrel being judged, and the men were pulled out into a world that expected them to put their hands behind their backs and behave. Megan slid from the saddlestone with his face wind-red and his hair wet where the mist had found it. He had laughed in the middle of that run because the air on his teeth had tasted of salt, and because a man had thought to light a pot in a harbor, and because a woman had told him not to. "No one is dead?" he asked the harbor master. "Not yet," the harbor master said, his voice flat, because he knew what death looked like when it decided to sit down in the middle of a morning. "There is time." He had the men lined along the quay in one orderly, disreputable row, hands bound behind them with the sort of knots that made rope proud. Helia saw, at the end of the row, as if he had been unrolled last, a man with a seahorse askew on his coat. The seahorse had not been badly sewn. It had been torn and resewn in a hurry, the way a man might fix his face after a night he regretted. She saw him see Megan. His mouth did a small thing that indicated acquaintance and calculation. Megan's face did a different thing entirely. It did not change at all. "Good morning," Megan said to the man with the seahorse. "You told my sister you would find me. You have." The man with the seahorse did not blink. He was older than Megan had expected. He had the skin that shows years spent at sea without a hat, because a man had told him hats were for women. His hands were the hands of a craftsman, not a sailor. He was, Helia realized, a man who had been something, and was now pretending to be a smaller thing for reasons he thought were clever. "I was coming to pay my tax," he said, with the insolence he had likely trained on younger men, until it had hardened into personality. "A harbor man told me ropes were thin here. I came to help." By bringing oil to make the waves go smooth? Megan inquired. By carrying a cat to help the dogs keep order. I am a Valyrian cousin, the man said, and Helia admired him a little for having the brass to try this move within sight of Tidewatch's bell tower. Oregon Valyrian came up behind Megan then, as if pulled on a string. He wore no cloak. He had put his sleeves back as a man does when he means to put his hands on a mess. He took one look at the seahorse on the man's coat and spat on the stone. Deliberately, cleanly, the way a craftsman spits on his hand to take hold of a thing. You are a liar, he said conversationally. A clumsy one. The man smiled. He did not look at Oregon the way men look at lords. He looked at him the way men look at a person they have told a good lie to before. Cousin, he said. Your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, Oregon said, swept the floor in the hall at Hull and was fired for stealing onions. She was no cousin of mine then, and you are none of mine now. Cut that thing off him, he added, briefly savage to a boy with a knife. If he likes to wear beasts, he can wear a cat. The boy did it neatly, the way you cut a fish's belly. The seahorse came away with the sound of thread dying. The man's coat looked like a lie without the badge to disguise it. We will talk later, Megan told Oregon, meaning. We will decide whether the cat is a cat of men we know or a cat of men we do not. Talk now, Oregon said, meaning. I do not like to let my temper cool. These are not pirates from anywhere I have not met. These are low men hired by a high man who cannot afford to be seen near tar. They carry. The harbor master had been peering into the bow of the boat, and he lifted something now with the tongs he used for the braziers, because his mother had loved him and taught him how to live until he was old. It was a token, a thing no bigger than a coin and uglier because it had not been made to be loved. It had a crab stamped on it, red once and now faded, the red of old wine on old wood. It was a tally token from Claw Isle's counting house. Oregon's mouth did that thing old dogs do when they smell a bitter. Celtigar, he said, and then, because one does not say such a thing without a witness, or someone who would have us say that word. As you wish, Megan said. He took the token as if it were something a child had brought him from the beach. He turned it in his fingers. It had that slight tack of old accounts on it. Sir Rald, he said, without looking behind him, and Sir Rald was there. Find Lord Celtigar. Ask him whether his counting house has mice. Ask him patient. Tell him we caught a mouse eating his grain. I prefer rats, Sir Rald said. They know what they are. Take men, Megan said mildly. And a brush for your beard. Sir Rald went because work makes men feel like they deserve their bread. The man with the torn seahorse watched him go and disliked that he could not think of anything to say. Helia watched the men from the boat be led away along the quay toward the small hall, with bars that had been built 20 years ago, when a Hightower scribe had pointed out that men who were not being seen to be punished liked to write letters about how unpunished they were. She had the peculiar relief that comes when a wrong note in a morning resolves to a chord, and the ear is satisfied, even if the song is not one you would choose. Megan found her in the crowd with the incidental certainty of a man who had been making lists of small debts without putting quill to parchment. You, he said as if they had agreed. You cut the knot. It was in the wrong place, she said, and because he was the kind of man who made it possible to say true things, she added, I like things where they belong. He grinned. So does my sister. She keeps the whole island on a shelf under her bench to take down and count. Then we are in good hands, Helia said, and the words landed in her like a stone in a jar of water, displacing her need to move. Come to the Hall of the Coals at midday, Megan said. We will set men to watching the steps. I will say it is because a woman told me a rope was gone, and the men will love that, because it will make the story better when they tell it. Nan, I have a basket to fill, she said, because the day had not forgiven her its obligations just because she had found a thing before other people did. Bring it, he said. Men like an honest basket near a dishonest boat. Ebonwing stamped, bored with being admirable, and shook his wings once because there was sun, and it was his by right. He lifted then with lazy power and crossed the harbor, and went to lie on the black ledge he liked, the one that warmed early and cooled late, and made the view of the town below seem like one of those toys foreign peddlers carried that were tiny cities inside glass. Elise heard the second horn from the hall and did not quicken her step, because she had learned that not hurrying is sometimes a way of telling the world that it will have to accommodate you. The Bravosi was gone. He had bowed and left a verbal compliment that had meant exactly what compliments mean from men who do not get what they want. Less than nothing. Her pebbles were in 2 neat piles. She washed her hands in a basin whose water had a film of ash and was perfumed faintly with bay. She took 1 pebble and put it from promise to problem, and felt better for the honesty of it. Sir Ralph came to her with beard unbrushed and eyes alight. "We caught a cat that is a man," he said. "We caught his rope and his resin and the way he thought. Also a Celtigar token in his boat." Dendran. Elise lifted a brow. "Ah. Not necessarily an ah." Sir Ralph said, "Faithful to care. Someone might be collecting our enemies' tokens and distributing them in the hope we will do the work for them." "That is an expensive way to lie," Elise said. "It smells like money with a soul, which is to say, like old money. Go. Ask Lord Celtigar to drink with you before noon, which will offend him and therefore please me. Tell him I have always admired the way his house can afford red paint without it looking vulgar." Done. Sir Ralph bowed to the insult and went, humming the small hymn he sang when he felt that the day had put an apple in his pocket. When Megan came in dripping, Elise did not scold him for bringing weather to her fire. "We need the lantern tower at Rosby to stand by midsummer," she said, rather than good morning. "We need their lord to think it was his idea to light ships safely. We need the citadel to bless kilns that are hot enough to make glass mendstone, but not so hot that they notice they are dragons. We need Oregon to pretend to be poor and Lord Celtigar to pretend to be rich. What have you brought me?" "Dender. Men who thought fire could make them kings of a morning," he said. "And a boat that wants a new name, and a token from the red crab that might have fallen into dishonest pockets or been put there by honest enemies." He sat and shook water from his hair and watched as some of it found the ash in the pit and made a sweet sizzle that no one ever hears in heaven. "And Lauren?" she asked. "Can he be taught to be cold outside? He wears fine cloaks and shivers with intelligence," Megan said. "He wants a Hightower road like a boy wants a sword. He will help us if we let him think he's teaching us why we should not." He told her of the kiln plan and of the priest who would be required to bless the road without talking about dragons. "We will build at night," he said, "and tell the citadel that the stars were hotter. They will say they knew," Elise said. "They enjoy a lie as long as it has footnotes." She took up her pebbles and built a short road between the piles with them. At the eastern end of the little road, she placed a blue-streaked stone she had found on a day when she had not yet known she would need such a marker. "This is Rosby. This is the lantern. This is the goat path the goats will not climb because it is glass. This is the priest. This is the bank." She set a black flake of cool Dragonmont ash where a smaller pebble had been, and meant neither to bless nor to confess. "This is us. You are a child in the sand," Megan said fondly. "I am a woman who likes to see what cannot be seen, even if the seeing is play." She said, with that seriousness that made men think she was laughing at them. "And women love her, or hate her for being a person who had a game she did not share." He ate soup that had a leak in it from a field he could name, and wiped his mouth and went again. Rosby by noon, the day said, which was absurd and practical both. Ailey sent a little caravan behind him. 2 carts with coal from the rills because it smelled of obligation. A kiln frame that could be assembled in a priest's idea of piety. And 3 men who knew how to say, "We are not dragons," in 3 different ways without smiling. She sent Helia too, because she had a respect for women in whom ropes disappear unblessed and appear again accounted for. "May," Helia said, when the page came and said her name in a way that made it sound like an instruction. "You." Elise did not explain the decision. She did not need to. Helia's husband, a man with heat in his hands and patience in his lungs, said only, "Bring back a piece of road." His mouth did not like to shape the words, but they were the right ones, and he knew it. Rosby lay like a man's sigh on the land, a low rise with a belt of trees that had been taught to grow the way a hedge wants to, and a stone house that would have liked to be grand if the stones had been richer. The road to it was a sequence of intentions. Men had poured gravel where wagon wheels had made grief. In places the rain had decided the road could go a hand's breadth to the left, and no one had argued. There were ruts that had been baptized so often they had chosen to remain moist as a style. When Megan's horse stepped on them, it made the sound a man makes when he puts on a boot too slowly. The Lord of Rosby was a man with a cough he did not want to discuss, and a face that had learned to make that cough look like a thought. He wore clean linen that had been mended twice, and he stood under a tapestry that showed a stag that had too many legs. He was a man who had strength in 2 careful fingers and weakness everywhere else, and who hid both thinly. "You come to light the bay and charge me for the favor," he said, mannered as a knife. "We come to give you an excuse to say you lit it first," Megan said, "and then to charge travelers through your gate a fraction of a thing they will not miss and love you for when their carts do not sink to the axle in spring." "My people are poor," Lord Rosby said, as if this fact had been given to him in his christening, and he might set it down only at his funeral. "So are mine," Helia said, stepping past Megan without asking permission from anyone who would think that necessary. "They are poor because they break their backs in winter and their wheels in summer, and count their coins twice and say 10 where there are 8. A light is a thing you can point to and say, 'I gave you that.' A road is a thing you can walk on without breathing like a horse." Lord Rosby blinked. He had not prepared arguments for being told the truth by a woman with salt on her hem. He looked at Megan for translation, as men do when their own language has failed. Megan did not provide one. He liked watching men find their footing on a floor they had not noticed. "Show me," Lord Rosby said after a moment. "Because men who have had honest wives or good sisters will eventually say this, if you let them." They showed him the kiln frame. It was a simple square with too many braces, a thing that wanted to convince you it could hold heat, by looking like it had already survived it. The mason brought it not inconsiderable expense from a village north of Duskendale, where he had 3 sons and 3 daughters, and did not particularly like to leave his house. Spoke of draft and bellows and seal, tapping things with a mallet that had his father's initials burned into the handle. Lauren Hightower, who had joined them with cheeks pink at the wind's liberties, stood very straight and listened with such attention he forgot to shiver. The priest donned a look that was meant to suggest he was liking the smell of the kiln better than the smell of sin. Helia watched the mason's hands. A man's words can be taught clever. A man's hands tell you what he knows. They fired the kiln with coal that made the air taste like pennies, and then hotter, and still hotter. The seam of the road, 2 rows of set stone that had longed for one another since they were dragged from the field, began to think of being one thing. The mason sealed the gap with a spoon of sand brought from a place where the river wore it round, and talked to it while he did so, as if explaining to a stubborn child why boots must be worn, even when feet would rather be free. Helia felt the moment when the heat found the right number for itself. She could have put her hand on her knife hilt and sworn she felt the dragonglass answer, as if a thing made in fire recognizes a particular voice of its mother regardless of the room she speaks in. "Not dragons," Lauren said low. To nobody, because he liked to be honest, and liked it better when no one heard him doing it. "Kilns? Kilns?" Lord Rosby coughed his thought and watched the seam cool. He put the heel of his boot on it when the mason said he might. The seam did not insult his boot by giving way. He did not smile, because smiles are bad currency in a hall where you are about to bargain. But the corners of his mouth admitted that the world had pleased him briefly. "We will build your tower," he said. "You will build your tower," Megan corrected softly, and Lord Rosby nodded acknowledgement of the courtesy inside the correction. "You will call it yours, and we will hang our lantern in it. We will keep the glass bright and the oil sweet. Your men will climb it and love the view. Your people will tell stories about it that do not mention us. We will place a counting table in your market twice a month, and men will line up at it, because they like their sums checked by people who do not mind writing. The toll will be what we decide it ought to be, and what you will stand to be hated for. We will catch the hate for you when it is loud. When it gets quiet, you will keep the coin. Dam dam dow. Lord Rosby considered, the cough thickening his thought without obscuring it. He had the look men get when they realize that the thing in front of them is both less dignified and more useful than they would have chosen. He took a breath too cautiously for a man in possession of lungs that behaved. If I say no. Megan spread his hands. Then the harbor remains clever, and the road remains a muddle. Your people will bless you for your thrift and continue to break axles in spring. I will fly home and tell my sister I failed, and she will put a pebble on one pile and not the other. And I will be made to go to Duskendale to beg men who think they invented coins to let us count theirs. Lord Rosby thought about hating a lantern. He thought about a tower on his low hill that would be taller than his house and envied by his brother's wife. He thought about his lungs and about the way women in their houses talk when the men have drunk too much humility to stand upright. He made the sensible decision. He did not like that it felt like someone else's decision, but men who do what is best often feel stolen from. When? He said. Now, Lauren said, startling himself with the firmness of it. Now, or winter will come and say, see, you had a chance and you missed it, and now it is my turn to make men curse. He smiled then because he had seen that in a book once, and had wanted to say it. To his delight, it sounded almost as if he had invented it. They set the sight before noon, on the crest where the wind liked to pause to notice itself, visible to a ship's eye at a distance, reachable by a goat's footpath that could be widened to a man's. Men brought stones that had sat in walls for so long they sighed when they were taken down. Women brought bread and water and gossip that made the work faster by making it feel inevitable. The priest set a wooden 7 on the grass, with a caution that made them all look carved from Sabbath. Helya watched as a boy with hair like Tarl's clambered to the foundation and made small towers out of 3 stones in a childish imitation of the large one. She liked boys who studied the geometry of love in their play. By late afternoon, the kiln had shown itself thrice amicable and eager to please. The seam it left looked clean and honest. Men stepped over it as if it were a line drawn by God. Lord Rosby had stopped coughing long enough to tell a story about his grandfather that did not make his house greater, but made it nearer. Megan had written 2 notes, a habit of his sister's that he mocked, and then replicated. One to Oregon saying the goat had found a ledge, one to Ayla saying that the Hightower boy knew how to nod at the right time. He sealed both notes not with wax but with a dot of ash stuck to the parchment with a breath of steam from the kiln. He liked the thought of Ayla laughing at him for being artful and liking the art. Helya asked the mason for a finger's width of the cooled glass that had sealed the second seam. He chipped it free with the begrudging care of a man who thought people should take their relics from churches rather than roads, and handed it to her. She held it up. The late afternoon made a wick of it. She could not tell whether it was beautiful or only honest. She put it in her basket next to a loaf and an onion, and a small wrapped thing that a Rosby child had given her on a dare. On their way back, the world seemed to be making up its mind about the evening. The wind went the other way once, and then did not apologize. Ebonwing flew ahead, with the tail half laziness of a beast who knows there is no other such thing in the sky, and need not prove it twice. In the low fields by the river's bend where the road to be thought itself into being between ditches, Megan saw crows rise in a black comma that meant no farmer's boy had thrown oil cake to hens there today. He slowed. Sir Raould, who had rejoined them with a beard that had indeed been brushed, and eyes that had been used to take measure, lifted a hand. What? Megan said. The word soft because the air required it. Smoke, Helya said, who had smelled 2 different kinds of it in one day, and felt she had a right to name them. Not our smoke. It came in pulses. Ebonwing beat twice and stood upon the air, and then dropped like a coin into a well. When he rose again, the island below them altered from one that was deciding on evening to one that had had its evening chosen for it. A wagon lay on its side like a beached thing on a mud bar. 2 dead oxen sprawled with the bones of their dignity visible under their hide. Men ran in the run of people who have something to carry away from fire and not enough hands. 3 boats were drawing back along the river. Long, low things with men bent to oars and not singing. Cat-tongue sails lay furled, catching nothing because they needed no help. Megan did not flame. He had been a boy once, and flamed at a thing without thinking, and had learned that kings of the air can be thieves of grain and fathers both. He dropped Ebonwing to low height, and let the great beast make a sound out of his chest that belonged to the world before men. The boats pulled with a new cadence born of fear. One went aground on a reach of mud, and swore like a lover who has misread the signals. The other two made the bend with the cat grace of men who have done that bend 100 times at night, and counted themselves clever for it. Sir Raould had a bow across his knees that he liked to pretend he could use as well as men who had been born with them. He knocked, and loosed the way men do who like to do something in a moment that insists you are not needed. The arrow went into the river and made a case for its own importance that the river refused to hear. Helya had no bow, and no habit of pretending to make gestures toward usefulness in a crisis. She slid from the cart and ran toward the wagon where a woman was pulling at a sack that would not budge because someone had tied it cunning. "Leave it," Megan shouted, and only remembered after the words left his mouth that this was not his sister's hall, and he could not expect to be obeyed for the sake of the habit of his blood. The woman did not leave it. She had wrapped her soul around the sack, and the sack had wrapped itself around her day, and neither knew how to unlatch from the other quickly. Helya said nothing at all. She put her knife into the knot, and it admitted that it had only ever wanted to be undone by someone who understood how knots feel about the world. She pushed the sack into the woman's arms and put her hands on the wagon's lip and heaved without arguing with it. It shifted. The woman staggered backward with a grunt that sounded like prayer and hate and gratitude. Helya looked at Megan with eyebrows that suggested it was possible to give orders after things were done. He laughed because the moment demanded it, and because Ebonwing liked the sound of his rider laughing when fire was close, and because laughter is sometimes a magic to which dragons are susceptible. He leapt the dragon up again and cut the air into pieces so that men on the boats felt each piece as a separate weight. One boat, the one that had grounded, attempted to make a fire in a pot, and thought better of it in the face of that black shadow and the idea of smoke on a river that gossiped. The other two ran and would not be caught, not today, because the river loved them for the cleverness with which they had named its bends. They poured water on the wagon's small fire until it was not a story that would be told twice. The dead oxen lay like history. The living ox stood with his head up, and a contempt that said he would have pulled the world if men had asked nicely. Helya's hands were burned in a new pattern that she would be proud of later when she told her boys they were not to brag of scars, and then did herself. Megan spoke to the men who had been guarding the grain, and listened to the soft collusion of shame and explanation that is the music of men who have failed in a decent way. He said something mild about next time, and then said something that made it clear there would not be a next time like this, because his sister would have a pebbled opinion of that. By twilight, the road to be had reclaimed them. The kiln parts rattled cheerfully over ruts that had been persuaded to be less themselves. Rosby's slope lay behind. The sea ahead. Ebonwing's skin took the last of the day and made it a lizard's dinner. Helya fell asleep, sitting up in the cart, head resting against a barrel of sand that would be glass, and then stone's glue, and then a story in some child's mouth when he put his tongue to it, to taste whether the road has a flavor. She woke as they came under the dragon's teeth of the inner gate, and the smell of the mountain greeted her the way a dog greets a man who has been gone a day and a year both. Elise heard them before she saw them because the hall has a habit of humming when her brother approaches. She rose and shook the stiffness from her back and sent the page to find Septon Raymar, who had been practicing blessing a thing without lying to God, and had got as far as, "We thank the gods for the minds of men." She sent for Oregon, and for the harbor master, and for the Hightower boy, because he had made himself honest to the road, and should hear the confession of the river. She sent for Lord Celtigar and did not expect him to come. He would send a man with a ring and a complaint. But she sent anyway because it would make the evening more awkward for him not to come, than to come, and she liked to put men in the position of choosing which embarrassment to prefer. Lord Celtigar came. He came dressed as if the rain had not been, and would not be, in red that was the right red, and made his wife's women envy whoever dyed his cloth. He came with 3 men behind him who looked like sons, and might have been cousins, and one who looked like a knife, and was not related to anyone in the room by anything but coin. He came with the face of a man who believes that if he smiles before he speaks, The world is obligated to open its hand. You sent for me at an hour that is not for business, he said, laying his smile on the table like a napkin. I have no hours that are not for business, Ailey said. Sit. Do you know this token? Ben? Sir Raoul placed the red crab tally on the table, with the delicacy of a man who is making a point for the benefit of other men, not because the object itself matters. Lord Celtigar glanced at it as if it were a recipe. It is a counterfeit, he said confidently. Anyone can stamp a crab in clay. Anyone with access to your table, Oregon said, appearing like the weather. Anyone who has laughed in your counting room and kissed 2 of your nieces. Lord Celtigar's mouth held his smile as if it were a piece of meat he was chewing longer than he liked. If you accuse me, he said, very gentle. Accuse me. I accuse you of not watching your cats, Ailey said, insufficiently gentle. One of them went out with the wrong men. They brought oil to my water. They brought knives under my lanterns. They wore your mark. Marks travel, Lord Celtigar said. Men borrow them. Men steal them. Men make them. Men pretend to have them. I cannot account for every cut of clay that has touched my table since my grandfather was a boy. Then learn to, Ailey said. Or I will teach you in the way I teach stubborn children to hold a cup. With a hand they do not like and a tone they will remember. Lord Celtigar's cheeks reddened. It made the cloth of his coat seem less handsome. He bowed, to the woman, or to the dragon, or to the iron under her voice. I will have my men sweep the house. If there are mice, they will die. And if there are cats who let them in? Oregon asked, almost amiable. Will they die too? They will marry badly, Lord Celtigar said, recovering his humor with the quickness of a man who keeps a spare in his pocket. I cannot spare cousins. I have never had as many as you. Spare your pride then, Ailey said, and moved a pebble from one pile to the other, so that he would know he had been counted in both. Help us catch a cat on the river. Send galleys up at dawn with your men who know the bends. If you send anyone who cannot name 10 places the river changes its mind in spring, I will send him back to you with a lantern to learn. Lord Celtigar tapped the token with a finger. It made a little sound like a pebble on a pewter plate. You will let me see your prisoners. You may look at them, Ailey said. You may not speak to them until the harbor master has finished counting the things they thought they could forget to bring. You may not offer them anything without showing it to me first, like a child who has found a sharp object. He bowed again, a fraction lower. You teach like a mother. I learned from men like you. She said. They made me patient. He smiled for real then. A quick flash that made him into someone he might have liked to be if he had not had to be Lord Celtigar. We will catch your cat, he said. Then we will argue about whose house he sleeps in. He took his token and left with the air of a man who has been given a task and intends to perform it excellently and then tell the story of how he was asked to do it, so that he looks charitable in the telling. When he was gone, the Hightower boy leaned toward Megan in the manner of a dog who is very good and would like to be told so. You see, he said, awkward in his joy. We can make a road and a light even in rain. We can, Megan said, and clapped him so hard on the back that Lauren took a step forward to remain upright. Tomorrow you will help a priest bless a kiln. You will enjoy it less than you think. Lauren's smile did a brave thing and held. I will write to the citadel, he said. I will say that the road is a thing of men. I will not mention dragons. I will not write the word Ebenwyn. Write Rosby 4 times, Ailey said, amused. They like to see their names on paper. It makes them feel taller. The citadel loves to measure height. And bravos? Oregon asked, idly flipping the token in his finger as if it were coin and not a piece of embarrassment. Will they ask again? They will ask better, Ailey said. They will come with favors to trade. They will offer us early letters and soft rates and men who count and do not cheat. They will say the word slavery softly in a sentence full of other words and look at my mouth to see which way it goes. I will show them my teeth and say nothing. You cannot say nothing forever, Oregon warned, not unkindly. You belong to the fire. He jerked his chin toward the ash that ruddled the pit. Fire buys people. Fire buys heat, Ailey said. Men use it to buy people. I am not a man. Them. You are an Archon's daughter, he said, which was the same thing in some rooms. Your cousins on the Smoking Sea count necks. They will ask you to help them count. They will, and they do, Ailey said, with that perfect calm that is not control but acceptance. And when they do, I ask for numbers and show them roads. It makes them sleepy. They go to their beds with the song of trade in their ears, and in the morning they forget what they meant to demand. You are dangerous, Oregon said, approving. I am necessary, she said, correcting him with the dutiful vanity of a woman who knows her place is not a throne, but is a fulcrum. The hall breathed. The mountain made a contented old man sound in its throat. Ebonwing snored in the way only dragons do, which is to say his nostrils made a series of small opinions about the air, and any rider who had bonded would understand them. Helia sat on a bench that had been polished by 3 generations of elbows, and took the glass sliver from her basket, and held it in the firelight. The seam glowed under her fingers, not because it remembered heat, but because it told truth under it. The next days took their shape from the first 2 of that week, which meant they were a braided thing of building and catching, of lanterns and cats. One dawn the river gave up a boat because it had been cornered between a sand spit and the kind of stubborn light Rosby's men had brought with them on poles, and called blessed. The men in the boat were the same sort of poor as the first, but had a captain whose eyes did not move fast enough to do him good. He named no master. Men never do when they still think not naming is worth something. He had 3 more of Celtigar's little red clay lies in his pocket, and a comb with a crab carved on it, which meant either a man in Claw Isles halls loved cats, or a man there had a cousin he was tired of. In the night, the Iron Bank's representative returned. Without irritation and without shame, he sat in the hall and drank the wine. Ailey gave him with the pleasure of a man who has always been given wine when he asks for it, and acknowledges the favor, because it costs him nothing to appear gracious. We are not in the business of slavery, he said, unrolled anew. We are in the business of memory. We remember who owes what. That is all. Ailey poured more of the arbor's yellow because generosity looks like confidence, and is both. I remember who owes what, too. I owe my people a road. I owe the sea a lantern. I owe the mountain a patience. I owe Valyria a conscience when they find it inconvenient. You owe us nothing, the Bravosi said, smiling beautifully, which is to say not quite fully. We prefer to be owed after we help, never before. You prefer to be owed by men who cannot pay without selling something they will regret, Aelis said, and there was no heat in it. It was the telling of a thing that had been catalogued. Regret is an expensive coin, the Bravosi said. We do not take it. You take oaths, she said. We will not give them. Then we will give you something else to owe us for, he said. Our letters, our blessing on your kilns, our silence about your night heat, our hatred of the men with cats on their sails. Then, Ailey almost laughed for pleasure at his honesty. Ah, we are finally brothers. Yes, we can hate the same men for a fee. That is the easiest piece, he said. The best pals are built of shared contempt. We will borrow a box of numbers from you, Aelis said. We will set them against numbers we have not counted yet. We will pay you with the difference. The Bravosi bowed to the math. As you like. Lorin wrote to the Citadel with a zeal that made the ink look young. He did not mention dragons. He mentioned kilns and drafts, and the problem of frost. He mentioned Rosby's men, and the way a seam can be taught not to drink spring melt. He wrote his cousin's name grudgingly, and his own with a small flourish that suggests a boy who has found the part of himself that wants to be printed cleanly. The Citadel, for its part, raised eyebrows in rooms, and breathed smoke in corridors, and found a way to say yes that sounded like a hymn. How Celtigar searched its cupboards. They found, in a trunk that had been his uncle's, and had smelled of old leather and pepper, for as long as the old women could remember, 3 molds for crab tokens, shaped slightly differently than the ones in use. They found a set of books with the listless handwriting of a man who writes numbers all day and does not care what they do to people. They found a debt to a Volantine with a smile like an embroidered cushion that had been paid twice and had been meant, The second time, not to be noticed. They brought those things to Alis, because it was better to bring them than to have them found. She did not scold. She divided her pebbles and made 2 new piles marked with a notch, one for mistakes that came of hunger, one for those that came of entitlement. She put Lord Celtigar's trunk into the latter with grace, and asked him to pay in coin and galleys both. He did not argue hard. He had seen the river's cats put on leashes and disliked the look. Oregon gathered men at tidewatch and taught them a song to row by that he had learned when he was young from a Myrish whore with a voice like a rotten apple. Sweet and wrong. They laughed at him and then sang it, and the oars found a piety in rhythm. He took galleys into the river in gray light and learned new bends, and came back with cats in his net and a hatred for men who threw oil at water as if water needed help to be treacherous. He came to the hall wet and pleased, and scowled at Aeolus until she laughed. He told Megan not to be a poet at the river. Megan told him not to be a priest at sea. They nodded at each other like the old friends they did not admit they were becoming. Helia went to Rosby twice more. The second time she saw the tower's belly, and it pleased her. The third time she climbed the scaffolding because she wanted to know whether the world looked different from a height she had not earned. It did. It looked like a thing worth counting and paying for. She ran her hand along the bright glass that had taken the seam and felt, with a private thrill, that the road held her touch as a thing in itself. She brought home a second sliver and set it next to the first on the sill. Her husband made a cup so thin she could see his jealousy through it, and then laughed at himself for a man too proud over his own work. Their boys learned the Hightower boy's name, and said it with the particular disdain children reserve for those who pronounce words well. Sept and Raymar stood at the foot of the lantern tower, as men lifted the cage that would hold the oil and the flame. He had practiced in his room, saying a thing that would not shame his God and would not shame his people. He found he could not say any of the words he had practiced. He said instead, "Light is work," and then boldly for the faith, "May the work be honest." The men liked that and went about their business with the vigor that comes when a priest has spoken like a man. And through it all, the mountain watched and the sea carried, and the dragon found his ledges and kept them. Ebonwing grew a little, the way creatures do when they are well used and not over-proud. His scales took a gloss from the constant damp, and children told each other he had learned to love rain because his rider smiled in it. That was not true. Dragons do not love weather. They tolerate it. But the story made boys brave enough to walk under certain shadows, and stories are lanterns as much as glass. On a night full of small weather, where rain comes in like a whisper and leaves like a cough, a messenger from Valyria arrived. He came without ceremony, no horn at the mouth, no blue cape paying tax in the first minute, and was allowed to be without ceremony because there are habits older than islands. He wore the pale hair and the unfashionable arrogance of a minor cousin given a name to carry, because an older man disliked being reminded of his own age. He had a ring with an archon seal and eyes that had never seen a kiln. He came into the hall as if it were a room in a larger house that belonged to someone else. Alis met him standing. She did not invite him to sit until he had introduced himself to the fire, as custom demanded. Men who do not name the fire are not to be counted in that room. He fumbled it, and she watched him fumble, because it told her which lever of his pride would move the room if she pushed it later. "Lady Alis," he said, and put the archon's name where it would lay nearest her ear. "The council is pleased." "Are they?" she said, not moving a pebble. "What for?" "For the compliance," he said. "For the road that will carry our coin. For the lanterns that will bring our ships in earlier and out later. For the taxes. They are pleased that we raise our own price and deliver the goods with a smile." She translated. "For the obedience," he amended, attempting to flatter and failing for lack of knowing the right word in the right room. She smiled then, because condescension is sometimes sweet as a dessert. One does not have to finish. "We are not obedient," she said. "We are useful. The freehold prefers obedience," he said. "Too quickly to be entirely loyal and entirely stupid. The freehold." She said softly, "We'll take usefulness. Obedience is optional in the provinces if the tribute is smooth." He colored as men do when women speak the thing they have memorized as a secret. He slid his ring in his fingers. "There is another matter," he said. "A proposed expedition to the Stepstones. Certain triarchs," he used the Volantine word because it made him feel more continental, "have been troublesome. A presence would be welcome. The council wonders whether your assets might be lent to demonstrate resolve." He meant dragons. He had the sense not to say the word in a counting room. He had the sense to say lent, as if one loans a cup to a neighbor for a celebration, and it returns with wine and a funny story. Elise considered the pebbles, and considered the sea, and considered her brother's face when he laughed in the rain. She considered the cats on sails, and the men who threw oil at water, and the boys who believed they would be safer under a lantern. She considered a freehold that would, if it could, consume even the idea of independent light. "We have a road to build," she said. "We have a lantern to climb. We have cats to teach the meaning of obedience. The council will not like to be refused," he said. "Then do not tell them." She said, and watched him flounder at the edge of the humor he could not be seen to enjoy. "Say our assets are committed." She gave him a cordial invitation to go to Driftmark and admire Oregon's galleys, because no one leaves Dragonstone with only a refusal if she can help it. She likes men to leave carrying a story that is mostly true. Megan listened to the exchange with the consideration of a man who has learned when to say nothing. Later, when the cousin had gone, he sat on the edge of the fire pit and watched the pulse of ash hiding red as a dragon hides bronze under wet basalt. "You are saving your fire," he said. "I am saving our people's patience," she said. "If we flame at the Stepstones, we will be expected to flame at every bend of every foreign river until our wings are tired and our mouths taste of pitch. I like the taste of our own air. I like the smell of roofs I know. You were born to the freehold," he teased gently. "You will die of island." "I was born to the freehold," she said. "And I will live where the sea and the mountain meet, because men do not own that place, and archons do not like to visit." He laughed, and the hall breathed with them. And the mountain set a small weight of soot on her shoulder, as if in benediction. They went to the eastern casements then, and looked out. The lantern at Rosby burned with the yellow sobriety of money properly counted. The harbor's own green eyes winked their intention to bring men and their loads safely to a place where ropes were properly coiled, and crows pronounced their liturgy on the quay. On Driftmark, Oregon went to bed for an hour, and lay awake for 2 with the taste of the river in his throat. He could smell new wood on his galleys. Tidewatch's belly hummed with the kind of work that likes to be made into a habit quickly. He thought of Lord Celtigar's red. He thought of the Bravosi knife-handle face. He thought, first thing in the morning, to have more boys taught to row. Boys who sing are harder to buy. In Old Town, Lauren received a letter from a cousin at the Hightower's top that read like a sermon about thrift, and then like a love poem to the possibility of a road. He grinned at it and took it to the mason and asked him whether he had ever been in love with a thing that stayed where you put it. The mason looked at him with indulgence and pity and said, "My wife," and then preached to him for an hour about lime and aggregate until Lauren loved the priesthood of earth. Helia came home with a slice of bread stolen from Rosby's kitchen because a girl there had given it to her, and a sliver of road because the mason had, and a pocket full of small coins that had paid for onions, and that someone had counted right in front of her without cheating. She put the glass on her sill and watched the evening make something else of it than morning had. She touched the knife at her hip and thought about the way knots believe themselves permanent until a better thought speaks to them in their own language. The island went on with its business of being necessary. It drew breath in smoke and tide and gave that breath back as coin and light. Men came through the mouth with sales and promises. Men left with lanterns, blessing, and obligations on paper. In the night, rain came that was neither dramatic nor shy, and it made a soft applause on roofs that told the mountain to be patient and the sea to hold its anger until morning. 2 days after Rosby's lantern made its first clean mark on the water, a boy ran up from the fisher's quarter with eyes that had seen a thing and a body that wanted to fall and be admired for what it had done. He used his breath like a coin and spent it foolishly. "Ash," he said when someone shook sense into him. On the green cabbage field. Warm. The hall went quiet without being told. Ailey stood before she could help it, as if some private string had been pulled in the bone. The mountain was not smoking any more than usual. The wind was not blowing the wrong way. And yet ash in summer has a language. It says, "I was not meant to be here." It says, "Someone else has breathed." She walked to the east terrace with her hair unbound and set her hand on the black stone that had patience in it, like a monk. She felt, in that old place where fear and love drink from the same cup, the faintest shiver in the island's breath. It could have been nothing. It could have been the memory of a whale. It could have been the mountain telling her about warm cabbage with the contentment of an old man naming the dishes on a table. It could have been the smallest cough from the deep. "What?" Megan said at her shoulder without making the word large. "Nothing," she said, which is what one must sometimes say to men whose job is to worry with swords. "It is nothing. Put a basket out on the sill. We will collect it and make ink." He laughed, and the island preferred to be that thing. Ink, humor, bargaining, lanterns, over any other version of itself. The ash settled. The cabbage field found its proper color again, under a wash of rain and a child's careless feet. And the only men who remembered to be afraid were the old, and the old always remember. By the week's end, the first mile of road was a set fact. Men could stand upon it and say, "Here, the world is tamed a little." The lantern threw a soft yellow over the bay that made even ungainly craft look elegant and put wicked thoughts to bed in reasonable men. The river's cats had learned that a certain bend now sang differently. The Bravosi sent a letter that included a compliment that tasted like silver and a newer schedule of rates that tasted like iron. The Citadel dispatched a man to look at kilns and say, in a credentialed way, "A feast, not yet." But a cousin of a feast materialized in the hall on a night that had too much light for sleeping and not enough for work. There were mussels from a bed only 3 men knew by name and bread that Lord Rosby's wives had provided, and meat from a pig that had not done anything personally to deserve it. There was wine that belonged to Old Town in cask and to Dragonstone in cup. There was a prayer that said nothing about dragons or obedience and everything about the dignity of a day's work. There was a moment when Megan stood up to tell a story about a man with a sideways seahorse and a rope, and forgot his middle because Helia laughed in the wrong place and turned forgetting into a better story. There was a moment when Ailey looked down the table and thought, "All of this is mine and none of it," and remembered to put a pebble in each pile, as always. In the small hours, when even dragons consent to turn twice and be still, the island breathed deep. The sea turned and went about the business of being a floor for moonlight. The mountain dug in its heel like an old dog and muttered about embers. Somewhere on the river, a man in a boat said to another man, "Not tonight," and the "not tonight" traveled up to the lantern and lodged itself there like a moth that had chosen the right light. Somewhere in Valyria, a cousin of Alis wrote her name in a list, and then crossed it off because lists are a way of pretending the world is organized and desire is an inventory. Somewhere in Rosby, a boy touched the seam of the road with his tongue and told his sister, solemnly, "It tastes like work." Dawn came soft and dull, and then was washed clear. Men got up and found their bodies willing. Women set water to heat. Children asked with their mouths full whether dragons sleep with their eyes open. The day arranged itself around baskets and kilns and parchments and the color of the sea. It was, in every way, like 100 days, and unlike them all, because men had decided that the world would be a little different, and then made it so, which is one of the nobler tricks of creatures who cannot fly or breathe fire. The road waited, its seam honest under a thin film of night. The lantern shone, its glass clean. The mountain did not cough. The island counted its pebbles and called itself ready for whatever version of commerce came down out of that day, be it honest or dressed carefully as such. And the dragon, who did not care for any of that except as an excuse to stretch his wings, shook the dew from his scales, sneezed ash out of one nostril, and looked to his rider to be told which way the air was better.